Welcome back to another episode of Free Space News. I want to jump right in today by looking at one of the many candidates that has announced their intention to run for president in 2020. And the one that I want to focus on today in a bit of detail is Kamala Harris. And I want to focus on her mainly because of the ones that are declared right now, I think that she probably has the best chance to win the nomination. So I think that her record is one that's worth spending a good amount of time on. I think all the candidates deserve basically equal coverage, but I think this is an appropriate one to begin with, since again I think it's fairly likely, given a lot of the recent polling data, she seems to be coming in third. She is one of the establishment favorites. There's a lot of reasons to think that she might have a very decent shot at winning the nomination, at least. So when I say I'm going to focus on Kamala Harris's record, I really just want to talk about one issue, and that's one issue that she's going to really run on, which is criminal justice reform. She's going to tout herself as a progressive on that issue, and the main focus of this video is that the idea that Kamala Harris as a progressive on criminal justice is incredibly misleading. So those of you that don't know her background, she was, before she was elected to be the senator from California after Barbara Boxer retired, she was a prosecutor in California for a very large amount of time. And that's kind of where I want to mainly focus on when I talk about some of these criticisms on the issue of criminal justice. So one issue that a lot of progressives talk about when they mention criminal justice reform is the death penalty. Now, it's a pretty mainstream position in the Democratic Party to be against the death penalty, and I would say it's almost a litmus test at this point. I can't really think of many well-known up-and-coming rising star Democrats that are for the death penalty. In Kamala Harris's case, there's definitely some issues to look at there. So according to an article from Vox, Harris remains personally opposed to the death penalty, and earlier in her career she'd be willing to incur political backlash by refusing to seek it in 2004. But as Attorney General, she told voters that she would enforce capital punishment, and she did. In 2014, she appealed a judge's decision that deemed California's death penalty system unconstitutional. So think about that for a second. I think it's a rational position on the death penalty to say, I personally believe that if somebody commits as horrible of a crime as people like Ted Bundy have committed in the past, I think it's rational to want them to be executed. I don't necessarily think the eye for an eye logic, or the idea of an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, I don't really believe in that. I think it's fine to want to seek revenge or retribution on those that are just the worst criminals in the world. But I think it's easily as rational for someone to say, because we kill innocent people so much of the time, I'm not going to advocate that as a state policy. Now, Kamala Harris takes the exact opposite approach. She personally says that she's against it, but she actually enforced it as a state prosecutor. And now, again, when you look at the death penalty, we kill the wrong people about 4% of the time. They talked about a study that concludes that there were all innocent people who were given death sentences to be cleared of their offenses. The exoneration rate would rise from the actual rate of those released, 1.6%, to at least 4.1%. That is equivalent in the time frame of the study, 1973 to 2004, about 340 prisoners, a much larger group than the 138 who were exonerated in the same period. So that basically means about 4% of people who were on death row during that time frame of the study were later found to be exonerated and were not actually guilty of the crime they committed. So on that same note of people on death row later being found to be exonerated, being shown that they weren't actually guilty of the crimes they were accused of, in order for that to happen, you have to allow for the appeals process and the appeals for people who claim to be innocent. In many cases, Kamala Harris has actually personally argued against people who were found to be who were doing appeals and were later found to be innocent of certain crimes. The article talks about, in one case, her office argued against Daniel Larson, who was proven innocent by the Innocence Project, because Harris' office claimed he filed his petition for release far too late after a legal deadline. The court disagreed, allowing Larson's release in 2013. Now, the article points out, and you could definitely say, well, Kamala Harris wasn't actually personally involved in these decisions to to be against the appeals process for these individuals for petty reasons. However, the article also points out that Kamala Harris could have easily approached the people who were making those decisions in her office and asked for more transparency. She was the lead prosecutor. There's no reason that she shouldn't have been involved in those decisions in the first place. Now, the final issue I want to talk about is a very relevant one when you talk about Democrats mentioning criminal justice reform, which is the idea of cracking down on police brutality. So the article continues about her record in that area, and they say, quote, Harris also resisted some attempts to hold police accountable for shootings, including a bill that would have required the Attorney General's office to investigate killings by police and efforts to create statewide standards for police-worn body cameras. She also defied calls to have her office quickly investigate certain police shootings in California. She's described her support for criminal justice reform as having pushed for better return on investment. Now, the body cameras one is really important. That's a policy that has been pushed in many big cities. LA, I believe, has actually adopted this to try and to try and have better accountability for police officers in the area. Now, regardless of what you think of body cameras and whether or not those are going to be effective in the first place, it's clear that that is what the Democratic Party is moving towards, and that's one of their main key policies when trying to address an issue like police brutality, which is obviously a very serious issue. Also, when Democrats are talking about criminal justice reform, most of them can't help but mention the war on drugs, which has had a disastrous consequence, disproportionately affecting African Americans, putting more of them in prison for doing the same crime as white people who do drugs at about the same rate, yet African Americans are put in prison about twice as much for it. And back in 2014, when asked about whether or not we should legalize marijuana as part of an effort to reduce the impact of the war on drugs, Harris actually laughed off a question about that. She heard the question and she just laughed as her response. Now, in her defense, today she has come around on that issue and has talked about how the war on drugs has had disastrous consequences, and she's come out in support of marijuana legalization. But how genuine is that really? Does she actually hold a principled stance on the issue, or is she calculating that most of the country is now in support of marijuana legalization, and that's where she is moving as well? I think it's more likely to be the latter. So overall, when you look at kind of the theme of Kamala Harris's record, whether you look at support for the death penalty or past support for things like the war on drugs, she seems to be not exactly a very progressive prosecutor, and she tends to lean towards more of she tends to lean towards an approach of punishment as opposed to rehabilitation when it comes to the criminal justice system. And yet she herself says that the U.S. needs to get its recidivism rate down, citing our 70% recidivism rate. But the thing is, when you look at countries like Norway, who take a approach to prisons that's much more based on rehabilitation as opposed to punishment, they have significantly lower recidivism rates than we do. So it seems like when you look at the evidence, these kinds of policies that try to punish people for doing, in some cases, victimless crimes, or in other cases go way too far in punishing people who actually have committed serious crimes, you're going to see higher recidivism rates when you put them in prison, as opposed to in Norway when they really try and rehabilitate their prisoners. So that's going to do it for today's video. As always, make sure to like this video, comment down in the comment sections, and please subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next video.